All right, so this is the second pre-lecture where we're going to talk a little bit about how factors influence design. And last time we talked a little bit more about how global, social, cultural, et cetera, factors get included in the design. And today what we're going to talk about is a little bit more related to how do you figure out what those factors are, and then how do you communicate what those factors are to people, because I think that's a really important component of being an engineer, especially when you work on community-based projects. So, how do you identify factors that influence your design? The simplest way is to ask. But more importantly, I think, is listening. So it's very easy to ask questions. I really cannot put as much emphasis as I do on listening. Listening is really important. Don't ask a question that you think you know the answer to and then answer your own question. Let a community member answer that question. Listen to them. Don't ask the next question until they've really given you that rich information that they want to give you. So this is the basis of what it is. It's ask and then listen for the actual answer. It's a very simple kind of concept when it comes to communication, but it's absolutely critical in being able to identify properly what the factors are that are going to influence a design. Talk to people. So a couple different ways to go find this information. We can't always talk to people, but when it's possible, we do informal interviews or conversations. Have a list of questions to ask people, and update that list of questions regularly. So one thing that I've done in the past as a researcher and as a consultant is to always have an ongoing list somewhere on a piece of paper or in a Word document where I'm constantly updating questions for whoever my client is. You're going to have questions consistently throughout a project, and just keeping an updated list is a really good practice. And then the other thing is to think about how to ask those questions in multiple different ways. The way that you phrase a question is not going to necessarily be very easy to interpret by everyone. So just think about a couple different ways to ask those questions so that you can really get the information you want. And then for your meeting, and respect people's times. If people are going to sit down and give you, kind of an informal conversation or interview, Zoom, in person, whatever it happens to be these days, you want to respect their time, and just make sure that you are getting really rich information and letting them speak more than worrying about trying to get through all of your questions. Now, sometimes we don't have the option to talk to people because it may be a community that's located very far away. So for example, our West Virginia communities for this particular class project were located far away, and it was very difficult to get a hold of any people. So many times we can use things like review papers, reports from past case studies to at least give us some information to get started. This is really great for economic factors and sometimes for social factors as well. So the United States EPA has done lots of pilot studies in many different communities. They have awesome reports that you can find that are really, really useful to give you information that might be applicable to your system. You can also use the reference list from whatever paper you're looking at as a way to identify more resources. So if you look at a peer-reviewed paper or you look at a report from the EPA, there's always going to be a citations list. Go to that list. That's a great place to start looking for more information. Learn how to use Google Scholar. So if you're looking for specific types of work, Google Scholar is better than just Google itself. It's going to give you work that's been validated over time. And then try and get really good about using key search terms. You really need to know what you're looking for these days online. If you type in drinking water into Google Scholar or to Google, you're going to get a lot of different things. So you really need to be very specific. And then you can also use news reports as well. So don't discount any of these different types of information as a way to kind of get some interesting information that could potentially help you identify those design factors. So what I want you to do right now is take a pause and pause this video and think about some questions you wish you had asked the community that you're working with for our group project for Dig Deep. Think about what questions you wish you could have asked to make your design a little bit better, and jot down a couple of these. We're going to try and talk about these in class, so definitely take the time to pause the video right now and write down some of these questions. So I asked you to ask some questions, but I figured I would give you some examples. So I'm somebody who works with communities quite often, and these are some of the questions that I would be asking as a consultant or as a researcher working in these communities. So I ask about the size of the community, what types of services are happening in the community, what types of businesses are present, what would they like to attract to the community. I basically start with community characteristics, what's going on, because that gives you a good idea of what some of the social and cultural factors could be. I then tend to go towards cost and ask about budget, and I ask more about long-term financing scenarios. Do they want to create jobs? Do they want something simple and easy to maintain? What kind of long-term costs do they want? Because this tends to be one that's really important to people and it's at the forefront of their mind, and so I like to address it early. Excuse me. I then ask about priorities in terms of technologies. Are they really concerned about sustainability? Are they really concerned about resiliency? Maybe we have a community that really cares about their environmental impact, and you kind of want to know where that ranks on a scale for them. So what about that technology really matters to people? And then I ask about some personal and community preferences for technologies. People really do their research quite often, and they think, I've heard of reverse osmosis. Is this a solution that we can explore? Absolutely. If they want to explore it, it's good to know if they kind of have a preference. It doesn't mean that you have to design specifically what they're looking for. You may come up with a really good idea, but it's always good to know what a community is thinking about in terms of preferences, because then you can maybe compare what you design to whatever they prefer. So say, for example, a community is really interested in reverse osmosis, but as an engineer that is very costly from a power standpoint. Then what you do when you present them your solution is you compare it to what they were thinking about and trying to convince them of what you've done as an engineer. So that's how you kind of pull in some data about those different factors. And then at the end of the day, we do have to communicate to the community. And so one thing that I like to talk about is kind of understanding that when you work with a community, you don't want to make it seem like you are an engineer who knows everything and you're just designing for the community. You want to try and connect to the community. And one thing that really helps to kind of start that process is understanding what we call your positionality. It comes from research a little bit more. It's not a term we use in engineering quite as often, but I think it is an important concept. And your positionality is basically a combination of what privileges or disadvantages that you have as a result of where you grew up, your education, who you interact with on a daily basis. So I am American and I am white, but I work with Indigenous communities in Canada. And so I need to just be aware of the fact that I have privilege as a white American when I work with these communities. And so my language and my thoughts are going to be related to that positionality. And it's also about beliefs and morals, right? It can be political orientation. It can be beliefs related to religion. It can be any of these things, but it's just something important to kind of be aware of when you start to think about how you write and how you present information to a community. So this is an example of a position statement that I've used from research. I am somebody who has worked with Indigenous communities in Canada that do not have access to water and sanitation services. And this is a very research-oriented position statement, but what it does and what I think is really important about this is that it acknowledges the fact that I have bias as a result of where I grew up and what communities I identify with. And the fact that I am doing the best that I can to try and faithfully represent the information that I get from communities. So when you talk to communities, they're going to give you information and you're going to interpret that information. And it's really important to realize that how you interpret that information is going to have an impact on how you present that information. So I say this with the position statement and the positionality just to give you a sense of, it's really important to recognize that we do have bias as engineers. And when we think about cultural, social factors, our own biases have an influence on how we interpret and then communicate those factors. So that's really critical. So when we communicate with a community, we talk about all these different design factors, we normally do it written and we do it orally. So when it's written, we want to choose our words carefully. We want to be transparent with every step in the process. So don't assume somebody can read your mind, right? You made a set of design decisions for a very specific reason. You need to very clearly lay that out in your report. You're not assuming that anybody is any less educated or any less intelligent than you, but you are very clearly laying out the process for transparency's sake, and that's very critical. You want to provide lots of references, and you want to have in-text citations. So I've made this comment on some people's initial water treatment design. It's great to have a list of references, but a very astute community member is going to read a paragraph and want to know more. And that in-text citation is going to allow them to go to your reference list and find that information very quickly. And that's all about transparency as well. When it comes to oral presentations, practice using language that's inclusive, and we can talk more about what this is in class, but you want to practice what you say. If you decide to ad hoc get in front of a community member and just start talking, you're going to naturally have words come out of your mouth that are fine in a normal conversation, but may be misinterpreted by a community. And so it's really important to have that practice. You also want to think about visuals on your slides. If you're going to use PowerPoint, we want to keep very minimal text and have some pictures and graphics that help you convey your method. So you've probably noticed in class when I put together lecture slides, I always try and have visualizations so that you can see what's happening in the system. I'm pretty sure that's a better way than just looking at text on a slide, right? So we want to try and give people a sense of what's going on. That's really critical for oral communication. When you're communicating in either form, don't make assumptions about the community. Don't assume that it's a low-income community unless you can verify that with data. Do not make assumptions. That's really, really critical. The other thing that's very difficult to do is not to position yourself as other. You want to avoid an us versus them dynamic in your writing. It doesn't mean that you can't use terms like we did this as engineers. That's fine, but you don't want it to sound like you are separate from the community. You want your writing and your words to sound like you are working with the community. And that's a very hard thing to do. Many people who are very well trained in this field really struggle with that, but it's something to start to think about doing. It's really critical. So how do you do it? You edit and you revise. I know many people just draft up their report, they look it over, and then they submit it. Really, really go back, edit, revise, read what you've written. Does it make sense, right? You can ask a professional engineer to read. You can ask myself, you can ask another professor, maybe somebody at work. Have them read it with a set of fresh eyes. You can ask a very trusted community member or a contact point from the community to read. That's also another great way to get feedback on whether or not your language makes sense. And then just be open to constructive criticism, because this is kind of a topic where you start to talk about how do we communicate with people as engineers, where it can be very difficult to get over kind of our kind of maybe an ingrained way of thinking as an engineer. So last, I want to just give you an example of some kind of standard writing and then maybe a way to make it just a little bit better. And this is not an absolute. This is just a way to kind of give you something to think about when you start to write your final reports. So as a standard example, we designed a drinking water treatment plant for a community in West Virginia. The community had approximately 650 residents and a preference for a small facility that's easy to maintain. The community wants treatment technologies that do not use a lot of chemicals as a result of cultural preferences. It's not bad at all, but it does currently position you as the client as somebody who is other to the community, right? And so you're talking about the community's wants and your design. There's nothing wrong with using we and the community, but the way that the language is put together makes it seem like you are separate from the community and you're not working with the community. It's also very much just a way of reporting information. This doesn't analyze information, and I think just reporting information sometimes can come off as very technical and really position you as other from a community. So here is a better example. Community A is a small community of 650 people located in West Virginia that needs a new drinking water plant to provide safe drinking water to the community, right? It tells you a little bit more about what's going on in the community. We reached out to the community to determine community preference related to drinking water design. There, you just told everybody that you're communicating with that you did take the time to listen to people. You know, you actually did have interactions, and that's really critical because the standard example doesn't tell you that, right? The next line, community members indicated a preference for a treatment system that was easy to maintain and operate, which we integrated into the design by choosing components that were easy to replace. This line, it does kind of sound like you're setting the community as other, but it's tied with a secondary phrase that talks about how what they want got really integrated. So it's more of an analysis piece in that specific line. And then the last line is the community also indicated physical or biological treatment processes would be more culturally appropriate. As a result, we avoided chemical coagulation and disinfection technologies in the design for the community. So again, these last two lines tell you that you did consult with the community and that you understand what you learned from the community and integrated it into how you communicate with the community. So the other standard example says the community wants treatment technologies that do not use lots of chemicals as a result of cultural preferences. That tells you a fact. Whereas the last two lines in the better example tell you how that fact relates to what you did. And as a result of telling what you did, as a result of learning that information, you don't seem like you're separate from the community. It seems like you really understand the community's needs. And that's just a really good way to think about trying to integrate and communicate with the community, that you really understand what that means and that you're using your technical expertise. So hopefully this was useful to try and think about how do I gather information related to those design factors we talked about, and then how do you communicate when you work with communities, especially if they're at-risk communities. So I hope this is useful to you when you write your final reports for your group projects.